Hi, we are live. Hey, everybody.
Yay.
It's John Tegg. It's your old pal. And today with me, I've got the legend, Mr. Sci-Fi himself, Mark Zicree is here. And Mark is a producer, writer,
director,
showrunner,
bon vivant,
breakdance pioneer, right?
And I don't talk about that.
Right, we're going to talk to Mark a little bit about some of the things that he's got going on, most specifically Space Command, which is an exciting new sci-fi project that Mark is involved with, that he's created.
Yeah. And also, Mr. Sci-Fi.
And Mr. Sci-Fi, his YouTube channel, which is something that I want everyone to do right now. Open up a new tab, go to YouTube, type in Mr. Sci-Fi, and click subscribe. There's a lot of really, really cool stuff on there, all sci-fi stuff. You got movie reviews and
I talk about movies and science fiction books and TV shows and shows I've worked on, like Star Trek: The Next Generation and Babylon 5, and I talk about Space Command, and I talk about all these great writers I've known, the Twilight Zone, crawling through Rod Serling's attic, being mentored by Ray Bradbury, all of these things, and I'm posting one now that'll go live in a little while. About Harlan Ellison, who was a great writer for Star Trek. We just lost him, a wonderful mentor, and he told in 1973 he created a TV show called The Star Lost, and he went on the radio and he talked about how it totally went south, and this has not been broadcast again since then. So I'm posting that interview. So I set it up. I talk about how that show came about, the history of those kind of shows. And then I let Harlan talk for about an hour and a half.
Awesome.
So it's great. It's great.
All right, cool. So then why don't we go ahead and just kind of let's do a brief rundown, Mark, of who you are for the people that.
Tricky.
Well, let's do it brief. The condensed, the elevator version.
Yes,
brief rundown for people who aren't that familiar with you, that are just kind of tuning in now.
Yeah, you bet.
So why don't you go ahead and
sure.
take away.
Well, I'm Mark Scott Zicree. I wrote The Twilight Zone Companion. I mean, essentially, I've been a professional writer since I was 19. I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop, which was the big science fiction writing workshop, and sold my first short story at 19, started writing The Twilight Zone Companion at 22, and was writing for TV by the time I was 22 or 23.
Wow.
Broke in animation, wrote for Smurfs, He-Man, Super Friends, Real Ghostbusters, tons and tons of shows. Then jumped over to live action, developed Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future, and then started writing for shows like Friday the 13th series, Star Trek: The Next Generation, Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine, on and on and on, hundreds of hours of TV, and then I opened my own studio and started shooting Space Command.
That's
there
amazing.
You go.
Yeah. So and one of the things that I think is the most interesting about you is the Twilight Zone Companion.
Yes.
Which is amazing.
Thank you. And that's the new edition. It just came out.
That's right.
It's over 100 pages longer. It's got 500 new photos. It's got links to audio and video. So you can actually watch TV shows that Rod Serling wrote in the 50s. You can watch a new interview with George Takei that I conducted and with Rod's daughter Jodie. You can watch commercials that Rod Serling did. You can watch tons and tons of stuff. It's really a lot of fun.
Right on. And you can get it on Amazon,
anywhere.
Barnes & Noble.
Everywhere.
Is it in bookshops too?
Yeah.
Okay,
it's
cool.
Everywhere.
Yeah, so look out for this. One of the nice things about the Twilight Zone Companion, and this is a nice little story I wanted to share with you.
Sure.
I have an 11-year-old daughter
time passes.
who is a big sci-fi fan and is into all kinds of stuff now. And Mark had told me that he wrote this book. I went out and got it, brought it home. And now one of the favorite things that I get to do with my daughter every night, we watch 2 episodes a night.
Wow.
And we're almost done with the first season.
That's great.
And what's great about it is she'll watch the episodes and then she goes right to the book.
Yes.
And just dives in. So I've even had a chance really to take a look because her nose is in the book all the time.
That's great.
So I wanted to thank you for that
sure.
because it's a nice special thing I get to do with my daughter,
well, that's
which is really cool.
Well, I'm glad, John. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's really fun because I started writing the book in 1977, and that's when everyone was still around. Rod Serling had been dead for 2 years, but his house was absolutely as he left it, with his scrapbooks, his own film prints of the episodes, and everything, and everyone else was still alive, so I could interview them. I interviewed over 100 people who worked on the show, and that became a huge audio archive that I then used in the DVDs and the Blu-rays, and I did 52 commentaries on the Blu-ray set, and again, to be able to get it down for the record, one of the great TV show of its era was I feel very very blessed to have done that work and to still be able to enjoy enjoy the show and enjoy the people who love the show. And
my daughter had a question
Yeah.
about the Twilight Zone
Sure,
companion. She
you
wanted
bet.
to know, like, when you were doing your research,
Yeah.
what was there any one thing that jumped out at you that just blew your mind?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there are several things. I was up in Rod Serling's attic, and there was a box that was unmarked. And I opened it up, and it was filled with scripts that Rod had written for the Twilight Zone, or that a number of writers had written for the Twilight Zone that had never gotten made.
Oh, wow.
And there were scripts by Serling, scripts by Matheson, by Charles Beaumont, 2 by Ray Bradbury. And it was always curious to me because Ray Bradbury's, 3 of Ray Bradbury's proteges were the main writers on the Twilight Zone other than Serling: Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, and George Clayton Johnson, and yet Ray only wrote 1 episode of the Twilight Zone. So there were 2 scripts in there that weren't made, and they were great scripts, and there was a note on one of them to Rod from Ray Bradbury saying, here's the first of what will be many, many wonderful, scripts for the Twilight Zone. And so clearly at the beginning of the show it was intended that he would be one of the major writers.
Yeah.
And when I first wrote the book, Ray declined to be interviewed. And I'd heard that he and Rod had a falling out, but neither would ever talk publicly about it. And years later, decades, I became Ray's friend. He became a dear friend and mentor. And at first I didn't even tell him I'd written the Twilight Zone book because I knew that there'd been this break. And finally we got to be good enough friends where I told him I'd written the Twilight Zone Companion, and I said, tell me what happened between you and Rod. And he told me. And it was amazing what happened, how their friendship fell apart. And so I have a Mr. Sci-Fi video where I basically say to everyone, sit down, get a cup of coffee, this is going to take a while, and I tell the story that Ray told me. It takes a half an hour to tell it.
So that's on your YouTube
on
channel.
Mr. Sci-Fi,
so
yeah.
Go to your YouTube channel and type in Mr. Sci-Fi. It's probably the first thing that comes up on the search engine, right?
If you type Mr. Sci-Fi, Mark Zickrey, you'll find it, SCI-FI.
Right.
And then on the landing page, I have hundreds of videos I've posted, but on the landing page, you'll find that Ray Bradbury one right there. It's Ray Bradbury and Rod Serling.
Awesome. And make sure you subscribe.
Yes.
That's super important.
Yeah.
And we'll tell you why a little bit later
Cool.
on. Okay, so cool. So let's move on.
Yeah.
The Twilight Zone stuff, that's amazing, and the book is incredible. It's super thick. It's dense. It's like a weapon.
Yes. yes. It can be used for home protection.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it could hold open a big heavy door.
Yeah, it can.
Okay, cool. So let's move on. So let's talk about Space Command.
Yes.
Why don't we start at the beginning?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, I am born. It's essentially, I wrote for many of the iconic science fiction shows of the last few decades, and I noticed a few years ago that all the science fiction at the time, Oblivion, Elysium, After Earth, Battlestar Galactica, which I loved, but they were all very dark, and the message seemed to be that no matter what you do, things are going to be really bad. The future is going to be really bad. And I remembered Star Trek, the original Star Trek that inspired me when I was a kid, and it said we can create a future worth living in. We can create a future that by reaching across boundaries and barriers with compassion and action, we can create a future that's worth living in. And the original Star Trek was done during the Vietnam War, during the Civil Rights Movement, and the cities burning from the riots and all of that, and it still was able to send an optimistic, hopeful message that got many people to become teachers, to become scientists, to really build lives that were meaningful. So I wanted to do something similar for now.
Right.
Something that, because particularly in these times they're so divisive and so filled with fear and so filled with hatred, I wanted to say that we have to reach across boundaries and barriers. We have to be compassionate, and that's the only thing that's a counterweight to all of the evil in the world and the chaos. And so I didn't want to trust the networks to not cut me off at script and not cut me off at pilot, or give me notes that screwed it up, or not approve my cast, or all the millions of things that can go wrong with the show. And many of my friends are showrunners. They wanted to take it in with me and sell it, even when it was just in my head.
Right.
And I said, no, let me try something else. Now, every show I'd ever done before that, the networks and the studios gave me the money. When I was a producer on Sliders, I didn't have to raise $44 million for a season. They just gave it to us. So, but with this one, it was very special to me. And I had done, a few years ago, I did a Star Trek episode with George Takei. And it was done, there were these fans who'd rebuild all the sets. And I knew that CBS/Paramount was never going to give Sulu his great episode, George Takei.
So this was a fan film?
It was.
Okay.
And so I spent 6 months building my team. We shot for 12 days, 9 days in upstate New York where the Enterprise sets were, 2 days here in L.A. where we built the sets for the Excelsior Sulu ship, and 1 day in Orlando with the effects team. And it was a solid year of post-production because there was over 700 visual effects shots in that 1 hour episode.
Wow.
And but it came out wonderfully. It was seen by millions of people. It made the front page of the LA Times and the New York Times. And it was nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula, which are the two top awards in science fiction. We were the first independent project ever nominated for those awards. I was up against Doctor Who and Battlestar Galactica and Pan's Labyrinth. And
That's amazing.
In fact, the fact that I was nominated against Pan's Labyrinth, Guillermo del Toro's publishers reached out to me and said, "Would you like to write a book with Guillermo?" And I ended up writing a book with Guillermo del Toro because of this.
Amazing.
But doing that episode, and you can watch that entire episode on Mr. Sci-Fi. It's on the landing page, and I'm very proud of it. But it showed me that you could do something of the quality of a network show. I'm prouder of that than anything I'd done previously, even though I'm proud of many of the things I did in network TV. But it showed me that I could build a machine, and without a network, without a studio, make something wonderful.
Yeah.
And so I run a roundtable in LA of writers and directors and actors and producers. It's thousands of people. We meet every Thursday, and it's just to create a compassionate Hollywood. And so I've been hearing about crowdfunding, and I'd never raised money. I didn't know if I could.
Yeah.
So I started with a very modest goal to raise $75,000 in 2 months.
Was that on Kickstarter?
On Kickstarter,
Okay.
and we raised $75,000 in 3 days. And we kept going. In our first campaign, we raised $221,000, and that was enough for me to open my studio, shoot the 2-hour pilot of Space Command, and we actually ended up shooting 40 minutes of the second 2-hour story. I've written the first 8 hours of the 12-hour season. And ultimately, my fans to date have given me over $1 million.
$1 million just on crowdfunding. That's incredible.
I also sold investment shares of $7,500 each to people who want to be more involved, and people stepped up to the plate. So I've raised about half the money from crowdfunding and half the money from selling investment shares. And if anyone wants to buy them, they can just email me at markzickery@gmail.com. And I'll send them all the paperwork and talk to them and tell them how they can buy shares.
Right, so that's a great way that people can get involved if they
Yes.
want to be a part of Space Command and part of the production.
Yeah.
Just go ahead and scroll back and listen to the details of how you can do that.
Yeah.
So that's really cool that you get your
really
the fans and everybody involved in that way,
Yes.
which is really nice.
Well,
it's one of the things that I think is really inspiring. That's why I enjoy being around you.
Well, also because I think I'm the same as my audience, and I trust my audience more than I trust the networks or the studios. Not that there aren't great people in the executive hierarchies of those corporations, but they have a different end to serve and different masters to serve. And I also strongly believe that if you mean what you say, if you want to create something, you don't pass the buck. You don't say, "Oh, I'd love to do this show, except that they won't let me."
Right.
Well, who the hell are they?
Right.
And the fact that my audience is willing to step up to the plate with money. Now, now I'm about to go and pitch the show to the big platforms like Hulu, Netflix, Amazon, where they'll have to buy a season. And the reason I'm doing that is because now there's enough of the show where it's sort of like, if you want this show and if you want what we stand for, and if you read these 8 hours of the 12-hour season, I'm going to write all 12 hours pretty soon. But if this is what you can get behind, then let's partner, and because they'll give me
and just fund the whole series.
Well, yeah, because that means that they'll give me millions of dollars, and it'll be easier to do all the things that mainly it'll speed up the process.
Right.
And they can also promote. The average cost of promoting a show now, just so people know it exists, a network show is $20 million just for promotion, and I can't raise that much, nor would I. If I had $20 million, I'd put it into the show, not into billboards. And so we're ramping up. We're getting ready to premiere the first hour at the C21 Drama Summit in London in November. That's where the executives go, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and all those guys.
If there was this, not to pigeonhole it, but if you were to, what streaming platform or network do you think would be probably the best?
Netflix,
okay.
yeah, because they, I've talked to a lot of people who have shows on Netflix, and Netflix is not intrusive. They basically trusting the showrunners, trusting the creators of the show, and then they back off, and they aren't heavy-handed in that way, and a lot of networks are. And actually, if people want to watch the first half hour of Space Command, I've posted that on Mr. Sci-Fi recently.
Okay, so again, go to YouTube, type in Mr. Sci-Fi. The first half hour of Space Command is on there.
Yes.
And it's really great.
Yes.
you want more when you're watching. You just like, oh, well, I need more.
Yeah, and this is the first half hour that we premiered at Comic-Con recently and the World Science Fiction Convention. It's got over 500 visual effects shots. But again, the visual effects shots are not what it's about. I mean, we're still polishing those. It's about the people. It's about the characters.
Right.
And we haven't even mentioned the cast yet.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about...
Great.
Let's start with the cast.
Sure.
Who do you got?
Well, Doug Jones from Shape of Water and Star Trek Discovery, Bob Picardo from Stargate Atlantis and Star Trek Voyager and The Orville, Mira Furlan and Bill Mumy, and Bruce Boxleitner from Babylon 5. This is the first time they've worked together since then.
Amazing.
And we have Mike Harney from Orange is the New Black, and John Hennigan from Glow, and James Hong from Blade Runner and Big Trouble in Little China. And just on and on and on. Christina Moses, who recently played a werewolf in the originals, is going to be, and she's on A Million Little Things on ABC. We're going to be shooting her role in January.
Great.
And it just keeps going on and on and on. So no one I've approached to be in Space Command has turned me down.
Amazing.
They all want to be in it, and because they recognize the quality of it and the passion and the heart.
Yeah.
Because they want to stand for something meaningful in the world as well. And this is all very gratifying to me. And again, I'm pitching the show, and I'm looking forward to having a partner like Netflix. But I'm continuing to shoot. I'm continuing to build sets. I'm continuing with production, regardless.
And you're also doing some other things kind of that augment it as well, like some ideas that are coming up. I don't know if you want to talk about those now, or we can, or if they're still kind of in the works.
Yeah, well, I sold a book that's coming out next year called Greenlighting Yourself, because which basically is just how anyone who wants to do film or TV or books can do exactly what I've done, and they don't have, because I see so many people stymied where it's like, I've got a great idea for a movie, I've got a great idea for a TV show, or I've written scripts or whatever, and then they say, but I can't get in the door, I can't get the networks to take meetings with me. And in the old days, that would have been true. When I started in television, there were 3 networks and PBS and major publishers, and if you wanted to reach an audience of millions, you needed a network and a studio, and in books you needed a major publisher. None of that is true anymore because of the internet, because of crowdfunding, because of YouTube, because of shooting on digital cameras and editing on laptops.
There's almost no excuse now.
No, there isn't.
Do it. I mean, that's kind of like what I did with my show.
Yeah.
The Rolling Soldier. If you guys get the chance, check out The Rolling Soldier.
Yeah,
it's on YouTube as well.
You bet.
But
again,
I never knew how to do any of that stuff.
No.
I just went and did it. And it turned out great, and it's totally doable for anybody who wants to try doing something like that on their own. If they have an idea, there's really no excuse not to do that kind of thing anymore.
Yes, well, I mean, it boils down to, science fiction never predicted that we would all have video cameras in our pockets.
Amazing.
And
well, Dick Tracy had it on his
wrist, but he wasn't making movies with
That's
it.
True.
And but again, it's like anytime you're saying, they won't let me have my dream, you really need to change that to, how can I get my dream? How can I make my dream happen? How can I be the catalyst? The moment you take power back, and then it just becomes a question of, how do I make this happen?
Yeah.
And and then it becomes magical. And there's tons of people who, once they see that you mean it and you're in motion, they'll step up, they'll help you. I mean, I'm not doing Space Command alone. I often say to my team, the only one who has to be here is me, and I'm grateful to everyone. I'm grateful to you, John. I'm grateful to whoever helps me in any way. And the world is helping me. I mean, there are 4,000 people, 5,000 people around the world who've given me the $1 million. There's visual effects people here and in Europe and in India helping me now, and on and on. It's the world. It's not just Hollywood anymore. Hollywood is a state of mind, and it encompasses the entire world.
Yeah. Awesome. Great. Cool. So what about your production team? Who do you got? What superstars do you have that are involved in that? Because it's pretty amazing.
It's amazing. Our character designer is Ian McCaig, who designed Darth Maul and Queen Amidala and Rocket Raccoon, and the villain in the current Avengers movie that Josh Brolin plays.
Thanos.
Thanos. He designed the Josh Brolin version of Thanos.
Okay.
And so Ian and I have been friends for decades. He works on all of my major projects, and so he's aboard. We're actually going to be doing a Space Command comic that's sort of an homage to Weird Science, the great EC comics of the 50s, and Ian's going to be doing the cover, and that's going to be coming out in November.
Super cool.
So it's really great. Yeah, I just wrote the script, and I'm very pleased with it. And we also have Mitch Suskin heading up our VFX team. Mitch is a 3-time Emmy winner. He was on Lost. He was on Star Trek The Next Generation, Babylon 5, E.T. I mean, this guy is a superstar. Poltergeist. I mean, he's just, an amazing guy, still working, still active, and so he's just come aboard Space Command as well.
What about costumes?
Costumes, we have Mike Philpott, who's a wonderful costume designer, and he worked on the recent Superman movie and many, many other great features. It's just on and on. I mean, it's just, I reach out to incredibly talented people, and
they're all, and what's really cool about it is they're all from different genres and fandoms and all kinds of stuff.
Yes.
So you're getting a nice pull of different people.
Yeah, and Gigi Edgley from Farscape is going to be in Space Command, and Armin Shimmerman with DS9, and Buffy, and Ethan Phillips of Star Trek Voyager. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of people where I'm writing roles for them, and we just have to get to where we're shooting.
Get it where it's going.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Cool. All right. Well, great. So one of the things that's really cool about all this was the attention that it got online when I started promoting it,
Yes.
and I got a ton of questions from people.
Yes, and I should mention, by the way, that John Teague is going to be in Space Command, too. We're talking about putting him in Space Command and putting him in the uniform. So just if you keep watching the space, John Teague, for all you Teagues out there, we're going to have a Space Command convention coming up in the fall. John's going to be there. We're going to announce his role at the convention. It's going to be big news, and I can't wait.
You heard it here, folks.
Yep.
I'm just finding that out, too.
Really
Thank you,
cool.
Mark.
Yeah.
Thank you so
there we
much.
Go.
Wow. Okay. So
cool.
let's see what people have to say, and then I've got a couple of questions I want to hit you up with.
You bet.
Okay. So first question is from Jade at Jade A Miles, and she's in the UK.
Cool.
She wants to know. You've mentioned a few times that you feel modern sci-fi shows aren't family friendly.
Right.
How do you feel this translate from the sci-fi shows of days gone by?
It's very interesting because, back when there were 3 networks, most shows, all shows pretty much were family friendly. I mean, it's, I remember on the original Star Trek, on City on the Edge of Forever that Harlan Ellison wrote, at the end, Kirk, who's just lost his lady love, says, let's get the hell out of here. And for him to say hell on TV, that was a big deal. I was 10 at the time, and so that's how things have changed. But the problem now is that even if there's a show you like The Orville, for instance, which has some good episodes, they've got jokes that are totally inappropriate for children, and so you can't really...
I can't watch that show with my daughter.
No, and so you end up having to watch Twilight Zone, which is a great show, because you know that there isn't going to be anything where your kid's going to say, "What's that mean, Daddy?" It's like, well, I don't know. And Star Trek Discovery, again, which should ideally have been a show that the whole family could enjoy. They've got like sex scenes with Klingons and Klingons eating people and just all sorts of stuff, and it's like, you just cannot, because you don't know what Pandora's box you're opening when you're watching these shows. And again, I think it's fine to have content that gets a conversation going, but not stuff that's going to be inappropriate or age inappropriate. So definitely talking about, we have to be compassionate, we have to be brave, we have to not assume that we know who someone is just by looking at them, that there's a human heart that we all share, and that opening up those conversations with people that are very different from us is very important. That's what you write about. That's what's important. You don't censor yourself thinking, oh well, this might spark a conversation in a family. You want that, and again, you're not preaching. You're not on a soapbox. You have to entertain. That's the first requirement. But within entertaining, you can also move people deeply. You can 1 hour of television can change someone's life forever, for the better.
Totally.
And that's certainly what Rod Serling knew, and certainly what Gene Roddenberry knew. And so that's
cool. Okay, so next question.
Good question.
It's really good. This next question is from Stephen Kiesler. I believe he's in the United States. Cool. In your productions, have you used CG characters, and how does that affect, I guess, the directing process or the production for you?
Well, I developed Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future, which was the first show that used CG characters on television. And so that went way back with Ron Thornton, who also worked on Space Command. Sadly, we lost him recently, but he also developed all the VFX for Babylon 5, really cutting edge, which I also wrote for. We're going to have CG characters in the future, which will probably be a mixture of puppeteering and augmented by CG. We haven't gotten there yet, but we will. I tend to like characters physically there, because then the actors can really interact with them. So in the one we're shooting now, there are creatures, but they're aliens in, they're physical, they're there on the set.
Practical.
There's a company called Imagineeric that's going to be designing those aliens for us, and Doug Tate, who's a big, well-known creature actor, he's going to be playing one of those aliens.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, next question. This is from Amanda at Amanda337. I believe she's in the UK as well. Cool. Do you write outer space sci-fi because it's a dream you'd love to experience?
Well, the funny thing is, Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein were the four great prophets of the space age. They engaged the public's imagination to believe that we could go to the moon and why we should go to the moon. And so they were working hand in hand with the scientists to will that into being, landing a man on the moon. When you really think about it, it's not an obvious thing for humanity to do. And so they were the great prophets and proselytizers of that vision. And it was a great optimistic vision of humanity cooperating, collaborating, and reaching out to the stars. And when I was a kid, we all assumed during the space race that that was going to happen. When we went and saw 2001 when we were kids, we thought that was a postcard of our future. We thought that was exactly what we were going to get. The space station, the colony on the moon, all of that.
I just saw it on IMAX with my daughter, and it just blew her mind.
Great. It's a great movie.
And she wasn't bored with it either.
Good,
that was
I'm glad.
The other thing. She was like really engaged with it, and what she thought was really cool about it was she saw all the influences in in Star Wars and in Alien. Well, she hasn't seen Alien yet, but I did. I picked it up right away.
Sure.
And other things that she's familiar with. She's like, that looks just like the inside of the Millennium Falcon or whatever.
Right.
So it was a really cool experience for her, and plus the seeing it in IMAX was
cool,
mind-blowing. I'm sorry, so go on.
No, it's fine. I just read a book on the making of 2001 that just came out, and it's terrific. It's fascinating. That was a game changer. It really was. But we thought that future was going to be the future we were going to get. The one thing science fiction never predicted was that we would land a man on the moon and then stop.
Right.
And so would I like to go out into space? Would I like to be on Mars and all of that? Yes. I mean, it'd be fun, and I hope that in my lifetime we land people on Mars. It won't be me.
I think Elon Musk and SpaceX are going back to the moon.
I really hope so.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny because when I was a kid, I was reading all this science fiction by Heinlein and others, and they were really writing in a shared universe of expectations that we would land on the moon and Mars and have colonies throughout the solar system and then jump to the stars. And it was a shared universe of expectations. And the early science fiction books about landing on the moon, there was always some brilliant millionaire who was financing this rogue project, a rogue scientist.
Right.
And then NASA took over the game, and then it was all going, no, it'll be NASA landing people in space.
Right.
And now it's back to the crazy millionaire.
The crazy billionaire,
Yes, exactly,
Mad
billionaire,
scientist,
exactly. And the funny thing is that Ron Moore is doing a show now that Apple's going to be airing, where it's an alternate history in which the manned space missions continued, where the Martians beat us where the Russians beat us to the moon,
right?
And as a result, we then had to go on to Mars.
Right.
The space race continued.
And that's Ronald D. Moore of Outlander and
Battlestar Galactica
and
Star Trek,
and Star Trek as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Great.
And also, by the way, you can watch an interview I did with Ron Moore on Mr. Sci-Fi.
Right. I was there. I was at that class, and it was incredible. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that too if we have some time. I know you're. I want to honor your time.
No, it's fine. We're good.
Okay. Next question is from Sonia at Frodo Cat's mom. Let's see. She's got a couple good questions.
Sure, that's fine.
Let's see. Okay, well, here's one. What inspired you to become a writer?
Well, it's funny, because when I was a kid, my parents divorced when I was 3. And so I had, I think, a very strong desire for escape and to go as far away as I could from that experience. And so science fiction, the idea of going out in space, was very appealing to me. So I was a science fiction fan from as long as I can remember. My favorite book when I was 7 was Farmer in the Sky by Robert A. Heinlein. And so I was watching TV and reading comic books and reading science fiction novels and anthologies from when I was a little kid. My mother would take me to all these great used bookstores where you could get a book for like a quarter, and a comic book for like a dime,
right.
And and then when I was a kid, Star Trek aired when I was 10. And that was it for me. That was the show I'd been waiting for my whole life. And
had you seen Twilight Zone before Star Trek?
I saw one episode. It was on past my bedtime, and I saw an episode called Death Ship, a little bit of it, on a TV that got no sound, and there was another TV next to it that only had sound. So these two TVs would be on in the garage, and so you'd have one channel having the sound and the other channel having the picture. And I looked up. I was with my stepfather in the garage late one night, and there were these astronauts landing on a planet and finding a crashed duplicate of their own ship, and inside their own dead bodies.
Wow.
I had no idea what it was. And later I found out it was an episode of Twilight Zone called Death Ship. It was one of the hour episodes and starred Ross Martin and Jack Klugman, but I didn't know that at the time. And then the next year, I saw an episode called The Long Morrow with Robert Lansing. This is like 1963 or so, so I would have been 8. And but I didn't really know what Twilight Zone was. But then it went into syndication when it went off network, and it was showing every day at 3 o'clock on KTLA in Los Angeles. And then I started watching it as a kid, so I was familiar with it. But Star Trek, see, Twilight Zone was interesting intellectually because there was all these interesting stories, but Star Trek presented that family, that surrogate family, people who were there for each other come hell or high water.
Yeah.
And that was such an appealing dream, to be on the Enterprise, to be part of that crew, that family. And so that was very engaging to me. And I recorded the original episodes of Star Trek on reel-to-reel tape when I was a kid, in case it never aired again.
Oh, wow.
And so that was, and this is before VCRs, of course. And then as soon as I was old enough, I started going to science fiction conventions and meeting the writers from those shows.
Yeah.
And Outer Limits was another show that was very important to me as a kid. And because I started noticing that the writers who were writing on those 3 shows were, for one thing, writing on all of them, basically. And also they were writing a lot of the science fiction novels and short stories I was reading at that time. So Theodore Sturgeon and Richard Matheson and George Clayton Johnson and Harlan Ellison and on, David Gerrold. And so they were my heroes, and I wanted to be like them. The first writer I ever saw in person was Ray Bradbury when I was 10. And Ray said, ideally, your work and your art and your life should all come from the same place. And that had a deep, profound impact on me, even as a kid. And
That's
so
heavy duty for, when you're a kid.
Yeah, and so I knew I would either be an artist or a writer. I was drawing and painting and sculpting and writing and reading and all of that. And so I went to UCLA. I got my art degree in painting, sculpture, and graphic arts. I was having gallery shows of my work when I was a teenager. But then I went to Clarion when I was 19. Harlan Ellison, I heard him on a radio show talking about Clarion, which was this writing workshop where 25 students would live in the dorms at Michigan State University for 6 weeks during the summer, and each week a different famous science fiction writer would come and live with you in the dorms, and you'd write like crazy. And most of the major science fiction writers of the last 40 years came out of Clarion. And so I went when I was 19, and I sold my first short story to Damon Knight, the writer who wrote To Serve Man, which was a great episode of Twilight Zone. He wrote that short story, and he was editing an anthology, and he read one of my stories that I'd written actually when I was 18. It was a story I wrote for a class at UCLA, my first English class at UCLA, and he bought it. It was a story about one year Nixon gave a talk at Disney World, and I realized that if they swapped out the Nixon robot in the Hall of Presidents for Nixon, Disney would be running the country. So I wrote a story called Leader of the Club, where the president is swapped out. It's not named Nixon in the story. He swapped out, Disney's running the country, and then decades later they thaw Walt out, because the rumor had been the Walt was cryogenically frozen, Walt Disney, and they thaw him out, and they show him Walt Disney World, which is the entire world. And it was a little satire, and oddly enough, it's still as current today as it would be back then. And he bought it, and the fact that someone was paying money for my writing told me that I could be a writer, and so that led me.
Huge. That's such a huge, not ego boost, but just a boost in confidence for you. You know, like having that kind of feedback from somebody of that stature.
Yeah.
So that brings me to a question that I have. What are your top 3 must-read science fiction books?
That's cool. Wow. Well, just off the top of my head, I love The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. I love The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. And what would the third one be? Whew, that's an interesting question. There's so many great books. It's what's coming to my mind is Fahrenheit 451. So that's 2 by Ray.
Sure.
But there's just so many great books. And again, it's whatever speaks to you as a reader. I loved The Martian. I read that recently by Andy Weir. The book, it's great. The movie was great too. And it's just, again, it's so. I tend to gravitate, and I'm reading the Expanse novels now, which I prefer to the TV show. But I find them entertaining. They're not great.
I didn't know that was based on
a series of books. It was, and cool. I've met the novelists. There's 2 novelists who collaborate on those books, and they're on the TV show too. 3 of my friends run that show, and it's fun because Space Command. I think The Expanse is a good show, but its view is that humanity, they'll continue going out in space and doing all the terrible things they do here, and that space doesn't deserve us or whatever, or we don't deserve space. They had an ad line, something like that.
Right.
And Space Command has a completely different philosophy, which is we can be better, we have to be better, and we can make a better world and a better solar system. And amazingly, the one place we haven't fought war Yeah, I mean, it's like we went out in space, and we've been in space for 50 years or more, and we haven't fought a war there. And Trump wants to, militarize space.
He wants to militarize it,
but we don't necessarily have to. And I think one of the reasons we collaborate so well in space is simply because it's such a dangerous environment. It doesn't leave a lot of room for screwing around,
right. Exactly.
and the other place we haven't fought wars like the Arctic or the Antarctic, again, because it's such an extremely dangerous environment. It's not, you have to collaborate, you have to cooperate, and I think that's a great message.
Cool. Okay. Moving on. Let's get a question here from Emma at Emma Hammond.
Great.
Let's see. What movies were most influential for you? It doesn't necessarily have to be sci-fi.
Well, 2001 certainly.
Okay.
I also love To Kill a Mockingbird. That's a great film, and the book is terrific as well. So it's a great thing to study when you're writing. And also, if you're interested in adaptation, you can really study that screenplay and the novel, because it seems like he just kind of took the book and made a movie into it, but he didn't. Horton Foote, he really...
he's one of my favorite playwrights.
He's great. Well, I had lunch with him a few years ago, and he was an amazing guy. And he told me a great story, which was after he did the screenplay for To Kill a Mockingbird and won the Oscar for it, tastes changed, and he couldn't get arrested for 10 years. He couldn't get a job as a writer, and he was going to give it up, and he was going to open an antique store. And his wife, who was a realtor, said, no, you just keep writing, and I'll bring home the bacon. And so for 10 years, he would go into his office and write every single day for 10 years. And finally, he wrote another script called Tender Mercies, and that got sold and got made and won him his second Oscar.
Yeah,
and then he was back on the grid. And that told me, that was a great lesson to me, because it was basically stay on your path, do your work, don't let the outside world, particularly the studios and networks, define what you're doing or who you are or the message that you have to tell. And so that was a lesson I think that I very much took to heart, that in a strange way led directly to Space Command. And so it was very important to have that lunch with him. And again, I always seek out mentors. I seek out great writers who have great hearts. And so 2001, To Kill a Mockingbird, the films of Ray Harryhausen I love, the films of George Pal. There's a great film called Robinson Crusoe on Mars that I love. If you love The Martian, go check that one out. And one time I had a screening of that film at, I used to get together with some of the Star Trek novelists. We called ourselves the Rubber Ears Club, and because of Spock, Rubber Ears. Yeah. And one time I screened that for them, and as a surprise, I had the two lead actors in that film show up as a surprise.
Wow.
And that was really fun.
That's very cool.
Fun. Yeah.
All right, let's see. Let's get another question from Suzanne at SSCHL72. When you were writing for Star Trek, is there something you invented which became real later on?
That's very funny. No, but I'd have to think about it, because probably in all the things I've written, there probably are things that I've invented that have come true.
I'm interested to know.
I'll have to think about that. But I was much more interested in showing things that I knew about that other people didn't tend to know about. Because, for instance, when I came up with Far Beyond the Stars for Deep Space Nine, that's the episode where one of the characters finds himself back in the 50s as a science fiction writer, and all of the actors get to play science fiction writers back then, or other characters back then, and you get to see their faces, the ones who are in makeup like Quark. You get to see what Armin Shimerman looks like for the first time on that show. I was really interested in showing where we come from as science fiction writers, that world of the writers writing for a penny a word or 5 cents a word for Galaxy and Astounding and a magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I wanted to show where we came from, and also I wanted to show why it was important to speak our truth and why science fiction allows us to create a future that then becomes the future, that the future of races cooperating and working together, and why it's important.
Yeah.
And science fiction has a role in that.
Yeah.
And so I'm very proud of that episode. But that was more me shining a light on the past that people didn't know about.
Yeah.
And
you just recently went to the Star Trek convention
in Vegas,
where they screened it, right?
They did, yes. They screened Far Beyond the Stars in Vegas, and it was amazing. Not just to screen it for thousands and thousands of people and then be on a panel with the producer Ira Behr and his cast, but also back in the green room. Normally they had a monitor playing back there, and normally people would just be bustling about and talking and so forth. But when I went back there and they were showing Far Beyond the Stars in sync with the audience watching it, you could hear a pin drop. The cast of Star Trek Discovery and the cast of DS9 were all watching it, just amazed. And there's a scene in that, back in the 50s, where a black teenager, is trying to break into a car, and the racist cops, shoot and kill him. and Avery Brooks protests this.
Mm-hmm.
And to see that now in 2018, when we did it 20 years ago, and have it be so timely now was just stunning.
Yeah.
And so the episode has lost none of its impact.
That's great.
It's a phenomenal piece of work. I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, well, that was one of my next questions of all the work that you've done. That's actually from somebody else here.
Yeah,
I'm not sure
one of my proudest stuff.
What are you most proud of, Jeff?
Well, I'm proud of a number of things. I'm proud of the work I'm doing now with Space Command. I'm very glad at this point in my life that I'm still creating new things that I'm still that still speak for who I am and what I care about. So I'm doing work that's as meaningful to me now as ever.
Yeah.
I'm not slowing down at all, as you know. But I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of World Enough in Time, which is the Star Trek episode with George Takei that people can watch on Mr. Sci-Fi. I'm very proud of Far Beyond the Stars. I'm very proud of the Twilight Zone Companion. There's a number of shows I've written for. There was an episode of Friday the 13th, the series, which I story edited that show, and I wrote an episode called Pipe Dream about my relationship with my dad that I'm proud of. And on Sliders, I wrote an episode called World Killer and another one called Slide Cage that I'm very fond of. So it just keeps
it's
going.
Hard to nail one down. Yeah,
there's not one favorite. It's kind of like the Harlan Ellison, the great Star Trek writer who I mentioned earlier. He once said that for a writer, everything you write ultimately is autobiography. And so my dad once asked me why I write, and I said it's the only way I know to freeze time, because you can say this is where I was at this point in my life and this is what I thought, and you can go back to that. It's funny, the roundtable I run, a documentary filmmaker spent a year following us around and made a documentary about the table back in 2009, and so I can watch that documentary and say, oh, this is what I was up to, and this is who I knew, and this is my world back then, and it's like a little time capsule, you know, and so I love that part of this job. I love the fact that I can reach millions of people, and they can read. I mean, there are people watching things I wrote 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that must just really be an amazing feeling, knowing that that there are still people that are still watching those shows, and still loving them.
Yes,
and I'm sure you get contacted all the time.
Yes, I do, and I'm very gratified by that, and I really love the internet, because in the old days, you'd write a show, it would air, maybe you'd get a letter, or maybe you'd run into someone at a convention who would say something nice. But now, via Mr. Sci-Fi and all these other things I do, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, etc. I can have a direct contact with my audience, and I can talk, because I have the big projects like Space Command that cost, millions of dollars and take years to complete. But the reason I wanted to do Mr. Sci-Fi, I was having lunch with Glenn Mazzaro, who was the showrunner on Walking Dead, and he said, you know so much about science fiction, you should have your own YouTube channel. And so I thought, okay, let's do that. But I wanted to make it simple, where I just turn my iPhone on myself and just talk about whatever I want to talk about.
It doesn't need to be any more complicated
no,
than that. Yeah.
And I post about once a week, and that's it.
Yeah.
And yet what it creates is this fascinating archive on this huge subject of science fiction. It was very funny, because when I was in South Africa last year, researching a feature that we're producing and Elena's writing, my wife and partner.
Who's fantastic, by the way. If you get a chance, check out Elaine.
She's writing and directing and producing Space Command with me. I'm sort of the lead dog on Space Command, but she's writing Subversive, and we'll be producing that with 2 producers in the UK. But I was in South Africa, and I get a phone call, and it's this producer on this new TV series James Cameron is doing on the history of science fiction.
Right, which is really great. And that's on AMC, right?
And they said, we'd like to interview you. And I said, well, I'll be back in a couple weeks. And they did interview me. I was talking about Twilight Zone. And but it's very fun, because, I got to be on that show fleetingly.
Yeah.
But on Mr. Sci-Fi, I get to talk literally for hours about everything I care about in science fiction, and tell stories that no one else knows, because no one else was there.
Yeah.
I mean, stories about Gene Roddenberry and Ray Bradbury and all these amazing people I've known, and Harlan, and that's a rare gift.
That's super cool. Okay, let's see. Let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
And then maybe we'll try to link up to the internet. For some reason, it's not doing
working.
what I wanted to do.
Yeah, sorry about that, John.
No, that's okay. Let's see. But in the meantime, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Okay, what is a trend or motif that you see in sci-fi films or shows that you wish would disappear forever?
Wow, that's interesting. Well, lens flares got really old really fast, didn't they?
Yeah.
JJ pretty much killed that one. Though we have a few of them in Space Command, but less and less and less. And see, that's another fun thing about Space Command, is as I'm engaging my audience in the process, they give me notes on the rough cut or on what I'm putting out. So they'll say, oh, well, this shot didn't work too well, or boy, that could be better. And then I go to my VFX people and say, let's replace that shot. Let's make it better.
Yeah.
And so it's really fun. It's like wet clay that isn't set yet, so you can actually start doing stuff. I really love that. But in terms of the trends, I mean, I'm glad that the darkness and nihilism and dystopia is passing. I mean, people, because the times are so dark in our real lives, people want something more hopeful. They want that. And so I'm not really, so in terms of the trends, I'm really glad. I mean, Star Trek Discovery is a very strange show, and I rather like it, but it's got its problems. Orville I rather like, but again, I wish they wouldn't have some of the jokes they have.
Right.
But that's why Seth MacFarlane was able to do it. Generally, I mean, I love Westworld. I think Westworld's a great show. I thought the first season was better than the second, for various reasons that I go into on Mr. Sci-Fi. But I think there's some shows coming down the pike. I think Ron Moore's new show about the manned space program will be fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds
I'm very
like
much looking forward.
Great.
Yeah, and HBO is going to do his Dark Materials, which is the Golden Compass trilogy, which is more fantasy than science fiction. But
didn't they do?
They did a movie.
They did a film of it.
Yeah, but
it was kind of didn't really hit. Did it?
It's a very difficult.
Because it had a great cast.
Yeah, but it's a very difficult series of novels to adapt. It's very complex. They were sort of thinking, oh, well, this could be like Harry Potter, but it's much more complex and much more controversial than Harry Potter. Mm. And so I had my doubts about it being able to be adapted into a movie, and I think a TV series,
work better as a series,
much better. I think it will if it has the right showrunner. And Damon Lindelof's doing a TV series of Watchmen, which I think will be very good.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of talent out there. And so in terms of trends that I wish would stop, we're in an amazing time of quality TV. I mean, the fact that Ron Moore was able to reinvent Battlestar Galactica and take a show that I thought was mediocre and turn it into something spectacular.
I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, it was a great show.
It was one of the shows that I thought is going to change television.
Yes, and it did.
And it did.
Yeah, it did.
I was a huge fan of the original series.
Yes.
And, when I was a kid,
sure.
The first sci-fi show I ever got into was the $6 Million Man.
Yes.
That was my favorite show.
Sure.
And then Star Wars.
Yes.
Blew my mind apart.
Yeah,
and,
warped you.
And then I got into, space epics.
Yes.
Okay, so we do have the internet up and running.
Good.
Let's see. Jack Scullion says that she likes the way you open up your videos.
Thanks.
With your intro. So if anybody's got a question online, now's the time to ask, because the internet is in and out.
But for those who haven't watched Mr. Sci-Fi, I go, this is Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. So...
Yeah, it's not. You can't forget that.
Yes.
Let's see.
And by the way, for those who don't know, Space Command is actually my tip of the hat to an old 1950 science fiction show that I love called Space Patrol. And they go, Space Patrol!
I remember that.
Yeah. And I never saw it in the live version because it went off the air before I was around. But I saw it in Kinescopes years later, and I love the show. And I actually got to meet and have lunch with Ed Kemmer, who played the lead. He played Buzz Corey on Space Patrol. He was an amazing man, great guy. And the fact that my hero is called Jack Kemmer, and I have a whole family of Kemmers, is my little tip of the hat to Ed Kemmer.
Oh, very cool.
Really fun.
All right, so does anybody have any questions online? I think we missed a whole bunch of questions, but
sure.
But now that we're back up, so go ahead and fire away.
And thanks. And by the way, all you fans of John Tague, he's well worth having fans. He's got great things coming. And I mentioned that he's going to be in Space Command, but also we've been talking about doing a John Tague convention. I'd love for him to do that. And if it's in my neck of the woods, I'll certainly come and moderate and do all that stuff. And because John is an amazing guy, very talented man.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so I do have a question from Frodo's cat's mom. Not only she had a question on paper, but she's also online watching.
Absolutely.
She wants to know, is there anyone that you would like to work with that you haven't yet?
Wow. It's funny because I've worked with so many wonderful people. I was just at the World Science Fiction Convention, and George R.R. Martin throws a party there, and I was invited to it again, of course. And I've worked with him on 2 shows, on Beauty and the Beast and on the new Twilight Zone, so that was very fun. But I'm about to do a new project for 2019, which is called the Showrunners Network. And the basic idea is I'll be creating 6 series with 6 major showrunners. And I've already generated 280 ideas for these shows. Basically, Rockne O'Bannon, who created Farscape and Alienation and Sequest and Defiance and Cult, is one of those 6. There's a number of other wonderful showrunners of that level that I'm talking to. They're coming aboard. I can't announce those names yet, but there's certainly people that you all will know of and love their work.
So it's six showrunners, and they're going to be creating 6 shows
I'll
simultaneously?
I'll be co-creating.
Is it a competition show?
No.
Okay.
The way it works is...
Because I hate those.
No, and I do too.
Yeah.
We basically will create... Well, we basically are taking the ideas that we love. So I'm generating ideas for shows, and they have ideas of their own. And we'll sit down. I'll sit down with each of them, one-on-one, and we'll decide which show we want to create. And we'll work out the show, and we'll work out the pilot, and then we'll either co-write the pilot or I'll write it, and we'll split 50-50. And then we roll out all 6 shows. We roll out all 6 pilots simultaneously, and our audience finances those 6 pilots as a slate of shows. And then we go to the buyers, and we basically say, this is a slate of shows. It's the Showrunner Network. If you want to buy these, you have to buy all 6.
Amazing.
And if the networks don't buy it, then we just reach out to our audience and they finance. These are our dream projects, the projects that we don't want permission to make. We're going to make them, and they're going to be science fiction, fantasy, horror.
You name it.
Yeah, you name it. And because again, with Space Command, if I'd gone to a network and sold it to a network, God knows what their notes would have been, but certainly I could not have gotten my cast approved. Doug Jones, Mira Furlan, Bill Mumy, Bob Picardo, all of these actors that I just said, you want to be in Space Command? And they said, yeah. If I'd gone to a network, they would have said at that time, who's Doug Jones? He played Abe Sapien in what? Who is he? What?
Yeah.
They wouldn't have approved him as a lead, or Bob Picardo, or Mira Furlan. They don't care. The audience cares. They love these actors and the shows that they've been spectacular in, like Babylon 5. Mira Furlan is a brilliant actress. And Bill Mumy is terrific from Lost in Space and Babylon 5. And
what you're getting is you're getting their fandoms also.
Yes.
How important is fandom to you? And what was your first fandom? Was it Star Trek?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I was a science fiction fan before then, so I was reading all the books.
Right.
But the first show that I was a fan of Lost in Space, but not the way I was a fan of Star Trek.
Right.
Because Star Trek was of such astonishing quality. Week after week, you'd see episodes that no one had ever done before on television. It was just unique, and that was because, like Rod Serling, Gene Roddenberry reached out to the science fiction writers, the novelists, the guys who really knew their stuff, who were also very proficient as screenwriters and teleplay writers, and that was the brilliance of both men. And so the lovely thing about science fiction is science fiction has always been a literature where the fans and the writers are one and the same in a certain way. They like all the science fiction writers start as science fiction fans before they become professionals. And Ray Bradbury, who was my great friend and mentor for over a decade, he started as a fan, and he published fanzines, which were these little mimeographed magazines that they put out before Xerox machines, before anything, and then he became a professional writer, and that's true of many of them. And they had conventions. Ray went to the first science fiction convention in 1939 in New York, and he told me about it. And so I started going to science fiction conventions when I was like 15, 16 years old and meeting my heroes and learning about how you could become a professional writer.
Right.
And like Ray Bradbury and like Rod Serling, who were my idols, and Matheson and Beaumont and all these other great writers, Harlan Ellison, I wanted to write TV and movies and books, all 3, because they were showing me the way.
Yeah.
And so that was very unusual at the time, but that was what I wanted to do. TV has always been my favorite medium, but I also have written books, both novels and nonfiction, successfully, and movies.
Right.
But I love control. I love that what I write is what the audience gets to see.
Right, you get creative control.
Well, yes, and that's why I rose in TV, because the writers run television, and that was because of Rod Serling, because Rod set the mold for the modern showrunner.
Right.
And so all of us love Rod, and he's our hero.
Okay, let's go to another question online.
Sure.
When you have ideas, this is from Emma Hammond. When you have ideas, do you write on the closest thing? Do you write on the closest thing possible? A Post-it note, your hand. I've seen you write on your hand. Yeah, he writes on his hand all the time. I was like, what is he doing?
Here's what that's about. I used to write on what I had to do on notepads. And then I realized I wasn't looking at the notepads. Even when I have a notepad in my pocket, I was forgetting to look at the notepad.
Yeah.
So if it's something really important that I need to do that day, I'll write it on my hand. And it's because my hand I look at all day long, one way or another.
Sure.
And so it's an eccentricity, but fortunately I don't mind eccentricity. I mean, I'm made up of, I'm 100%
eccentric.
polyunsaturated eccentricity. Yeah, exactly. And but in terms of my writing, generally I'll jot that down on notepads or on like yellow pads, and then I type the script. So sometimes for instance, I met with HBO 3 days ago, and it was a great meeting, really fun, and we were talking about me doing a show about my family, and I've actually written 4 pilots for 3 networks about my family,
Wow.
two for NBC, 1 for ABC, and 1 for Showtime, and I've also written a screenplay about my family that's been optioned many times. I have an extremely unusual family, and so I immediately started thinking about a new show about my family now.
Mm-hmm.
My wife's family, my siblings, etc., our parents, and it's called The Life We Get,
Mm-hmm.
and it's basically about as you get into your 30s and into your 40s and 50s, you start to see the shape of your life. Because when you're in your 20s, and sometimes even into your early 30s, your life can be anything. It's like you don't know what it's going to be. You have ambitions. You think, oh, well, I can try this out. I can try that out. But as you move into your 40s, you start to say, well, okay, I haven't succeeded yet, or I haven't gotten married, or I haven't had kids. Yes,
yeah.
and the question becomes, how much are you willing to settle for, or are you willing to really go for happiness, really take the dangerous chances
Yeah.
and risks? Because if you're in a job and it's paying you well, but you're not happy, you have the choice of either staying in that job and living a life that's not happy, or throwing it over and risking misery, but also risking happiness. And so it's about that in a lot of different iterations through my family.
That's cool. So,
Yeah.
and it's a bit of a
Yeah.
departure from
Yes.
what you're mostly
Yes,
known for.
and the life we get, the reason it's called the life we get is sometimes you can have one of 2 assumptions. The life we get is like, well, I had bad breaks, I had bad luck, I just had the life I got.
Yeah.
Or you can say the life I get is the life I choose to get, the life
Right.
I make happen.
Right.
And it's about those choices. So it's really, I started jotting notes on it, and now I know what the show's about. I've laid out the first 3 seasons.
Well, that sounds great.
And,
With
yeah.
shows like This Is Us and
Yes,
things
yes.
like that, there's a
Yeah.
huge audience for that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
and again, it's not, I never write from, oh, what's popular, I think
Right,
I'll do
no,
that.
I didn't
No,
say
but
that.
no,
Yeah.
and I didn't interpret it that way. What I write for is where I find an enthusiasm and a passion.
Right.
And my head is a science fiction head, so that's very easy for me to come up with science fiction ideas. But in this case, if I hadn't had that conversation, I wouldn't have come up with this idea.
Right.
But once I started thinking about the idea, I always work on an idea until I know what it's about, deeply, profoundly. And once I know what it's about, then I know how to build it and work it and what happens in it. And you can tell if an idea has enough content to be a show, because certain things are only 2-hour stories, and certain things you can roll out for years.
Right.
So that's where you have to have those instincts.
Do you have a certain time of day where you like to write, or is there like a ritual around your writing?
Yeah. It used to be that I would tend to want to write morning into the early afternoon,
Mm-hmm.
but now because my life is so active in terms of being a producer and a director, that it's kind of, I have to really make the time, and so I can write. Like, for instance, I wrote the first Space Command comic book story. It's 25 pages. I wrote 20 pages of that, the first draft of it, in one evening a few days ago. Because, again, I talked with Ian on Saturday night. He said I was engaged in talking to Ian McCaig about doing the cover, and we wanted to have it as a free comic book we would give out at the C21 Drama Summit in November, where we're premiering the first hour of Space
And
Command.
that's going to be in London.
London,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
And so I'll be in London.
So we got a lot of
Yeah.
people that are tuning in from the UK,
Yep,
so
yep.
it might be something interesting
Yeah,
that they might want to
that'd
check
be cool.
out.
Yes, and but we wanted to do a comic book, and so I talked to Ian McCaig. I had dinner with him on Saturday, and I knew that I had to write the story to engage his enthusiasms and to get an artist aboard in time. So I just had an idea, and I just sat down and I wrote it in one sitting. 20 pages. And it's nice to know that I still have those muscles. That I can still do that. I
Sure,
really
yeah.
liked it. I was really happy with it.
It's like
And then-
torture for me just to get like 2 or 3 pages.
Yeah, well, I'm
you
a
know?
TV writer, and I literally love to multitask, and I can write very quickly
Yeah.
if I need to. And so, for instance, so then I spent a couple days just here and there making notes and expanding it out by 5 pages. So now it's 25 pages, and that's pretty much, I'll tweak it a little more, but that's basically.
it.
But if it's a direct prequel to the pilot.
Cool.
So it's really fun because the pilot.
Is there a way that
Yeah.
that if people that don't attend
Yes.
the Drama Summit, will there be a way
Yes.
that they could see it
Yes.
as well?
Yes, we'll make it a downloadable comic book, and we'll also
cool.
have a physical copy people can buy via the
Awesome.
Space Command store. If you go to the Space Command website, spacecommandseries.com, you can check out the Space Command store. You can buy stuff. Like T-shirts and jackets and models of the ship and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But but yeah, and it's just kind of really fun doing all this stuff, And so I can get that enthusiasm. The most I ever wrote. There are two things that are the most I ever wrote. I wrote a 55-page script in one day, and this is back before computers, and this is for a show, I think it was Black Star. It was a show on Filmation, and the Filmation did for CBS, and I was writing so quickly that I was writing by hand and handing the pages off to Elaine, who was typing them, because she was a faster typist than I was. This is just before computers came in. My first computer was a K-Pro 2. And, but that was the most I ever wrote in a single day, 55 pages. And that got made. That got shot.
Amazing.
And the other one was there was one period of, I think, 3 months where I did 9 scripts for 6 different shows. And there was one, and I was basically staggering it, so I'd be outlining one while I was writing another. But there was 1 week where 2 shows needed a script done by the end of that week, and they wouldn't budge. So I had to write 2-hour scripts in 1 week. And the way I did it was I would write 10 pages one in the morning, have lunch to clear my head, then write 10 pages the other one in the afternoon. So at the end of 6 days, I had 2 60-page scripts.
Wow.
It was one was Space Precinct, and the other was a show called Forever Night, and they both got made.
Right.
I burnt out brain cells doing that.
Yeah.
That was maximum capacity.
It's really prolific. All that,
Fun.
all that. You're just pushing that content.
Right.
That must be something. Is that something that you were naturally kind of inclined to do, or is it
No.
a way, or did you build up to becoming
Yeah.
that efficient with your writing?
Yeah, what happened was, and also you never sacrifice quality. You're always giving it your A game. You always aim for for the fences. You never say, oh, this is just a piece of shit, I'll just do a shitty job. Never. I mean, I've worked as hard on a script for Smurfs as I'm working on Space Command. It's like, okay, someone once asked me when I was writing cartoons, they said, are you writing for the children in the audience? And I said, no, I'm writing for the child in myself. And that was true. If it entertains me, if it moves me. I mean, frequently I'll write a script and I'll have tears. I'll be crying if it's a moving scene. For instance, when I wrote World Enough in Time with Michael Reeves, the Sulu episode, which again you can watch on Mr. Sci-Fi, my YouTube channel. But when I finished it, I was in tears, and the audience is in tears when they watch that episode, and that means it worked.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of it. So, but in terms of speed, you develop those muscles. It's like going to the gym. I was always pretty fast, but I got a lot faster. And again, if I have more time, I'll take more time. I mean, some Space Command scripts I've worked on for several years, on and off, just to get them right or to play with stuff. Or you'll watch something and say, "Oh, let's go down that road. Let's explore that."
Right.
So when I sat down after the Kickstarter campaign and wrote the first 8 hours of Space Command, those scripts are ultimately very different from what we're shooting.
Okay.
Just because
things change.
Well, yeah. Like to give you an example, I was at Comic-Con. For the last 5-6 years, we've had a Space Command panel each year at Comic-Con, and this year we premiered the first half hour, and of the pilot, the 2-hour pilot, and I also had a Space Command booth this year. And Stan Rutledge, who's a dear friend and fan, he has a print shop and he provides all of our graphics, and he basically made a booth for us, and we had to pay for the rental at Comic-Con, but he made the booth, which was terrific, and just a great guy. And so I got a phone call just before Comic-Con. It was a friend of mine, and he said, I have a big favor to ask. And I said, what is it? And he said, Nichelle Nichols needs a place to sign her photos. She's selling her photos. Could we use your booth? And I said, of course.
Yeah, that's
of
gold.
Course. Well, when
Comic-Con.
when I was a kid and Star Trek was on the air when I was 10, my mom was dating, I was being raised by a divorced mom, and she had a boyfriend named Eddie Leroy, and he had been one of the dead-end kids in the movies. And and he... one day he said, get in the car, I've got a surprise for you. And he drove me to an apartment, and he knocked on the door, and Nichelle Nichols opened the door. And this is when Star Trek was on.
Right.
And it was her apartment. They were friends. And she gave me a signed photo of herself as Uhura and a signed script. It was her script of an episode, wow. Mimeo, not Xerox.
Yeah.
And I was a smart kid at 10, and I said, do you have any more of these? And she reached in her wastebasket, and she pulled out 5 other scripts. So I've still got those. They're one of my they're my treasured possessions. But so she was signing at my booth. Of course I was going to say yes, given that history.
Yeah.
And even if I hadn't had that history, I would have said yes. And because Star Trek was so responsible for my career. And she's wonderful, and she's 85 now, and her team was with her, and I immediately thought of a scene in Space Command that she could do. And we're going to make it very easy for her. We're going to shoot it all on one day, and it's going to be great. And we're now in conversation with her team to make it possible.
Amazing.
And so that meant that I went to the second script, which we shot 40 minutes of, the 2-hour script, and there was one scene, and I rewrote that scene, and I immediately sent it to her team so she could be that character. And it's fun because I'm naming many of the Space Command characters after famous science fiction writers. So you've got Lieutenant Bradbury and someone named after Lee Brackett, who's another famous science fiction writer. And
there Heinlein?
There's not yet, but there will be. Okay. There absolutely will be. But there's named after all these different science fiction writers, Clifford Simak and so forth. And so her character is going to be named Octavia Butler. after the very famous science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who I knew personally. And we were in Ted Sturgeon's writing class together back in the 70s, but she wrote some wonderful novels, and so I think that'll be another tip of the hat. Yes. Yeah. Well, I have General Joe Haldeman. Joe Haldeman was one of my teachers at Clarion. He wrote The Forever War, and Bruce Boxleitner plays that character, and they're both fans of each other. So they're both thrilled that they got that opportunity.
Bruce Boxleitner, was he in Tron? Right.
He was in Tron, and he starred in Babylon 5,
right,
which is where I dealt with him. So so it's just, I mean, I feel honored to be able to work with all these people.
It's an amazing, cast you've assembled. Yeah. It's an amazing group of, the crew and the production people that you've assembled. I mean, it's really phenomenal.
Yeah, but also so many people who are just fans. They end up building the sets, or they end up, just doing VFX shots. There's a great guy named Albert Martinez who's a fan, and his hobby is VFX, and he's some of the opening shots in Space Command he did.
Yeah.
And so I'm not a snob. I view people by what they can do, not by anything else.
Right.
And so and by their heart. If someone comes with a good heart, I'm open to what they can do. So if someone, like we're about to announce a John Tague exclusive.
Here it comes.
We're about
Brace
to announce,
yourself.
yes, the Great Space Command Spacesuit Contest. Now, our audience has financed us, and we had two of our lead actors. We had a casting search, a worldwide talent search, where anyone could audition for lead roles, and many of our actors we got from that. Ethan McDowell and Brian McClure and Sarah Marifino came from that. We had thousands of inquiries and 1,200 videos, and we cast. So I thought, okay, how can I also engage the audience more? And I thought, okay, I love spacesuits. I've always loved spacesuits. I actually own a real spacesuit that was used in Twilight Zone, and I'm in it. If you watch the Space Command pilot, I have a cameo, and I'm in my own spacesuit that my mom bought for me when I was 12.
It's worth viewing just for that.
Just for that, yeah, it is. But we're going to have the Great Space Command Spacesuit Contest, and this is not to design a spacesuit on paper. It's to make one, which we then will use in Space Command. And so the way it works is Ian McCaig, the great designer of Star Wars and many other things that we mentioned earlier, he's done some fabulous spacesuit designs for us. We also have another artist who's done some other great designs. So you can either take our designs, or Ed Emshwiller, who was a phenomenal science fiction artist of the 50s, his kids have approved us using spacesuits that he designed.
Oh, wow.
He did the cover of Robert Heinlein's Have Spacesuit Will Travel. It's one of my favorite illustrations ever. I loved it as a kid, and do to this day. So you can make that spacesuit, or you can make one of your own design. We have steampunk categories. We have a category of spacesuits made for $100 or less from parts exclusively from Home Depot or Lowe's. We have one category that's built by a 14-year-old or younger, so a kids category. And we'll have wonderful prizes, including tickets to the Space Command premiere at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. The grand prize will be your own Space Command uniform, built by Mike Philpott and designed by Ethan McCaig in your sizes, and it'll be as good as anything you see on the show. And so that's the grand prize, and that comes with tickets to the premiere for your whole family. I mean, you have to pay to get here,
right.
but that's, and so the way it works is, I'm going to post very soon. I'm going to post the rules, and I'll do a Mr. Sci-Fi video about it with a link and to where you can download the rules. And the basic thing is, you send it in. We own the spacesuit because we're going to use a lot of these spacesuits. You get everyone who enters the contest gets credited as a spacesuit builder on the credits on the show. And you get, and the top guys will win prizes, and everyone gets credit, and we own the spacesuit, but you get the credit, and that can go on IMDb or wherever you'd like it, and the winners will get to come to the premiere, and they'll be on the set when we use the spacesuits.
Awesome. Maybe come to the con.
That's right.
That's right.
We're gonna have a Space Command convention, and where we'll have the spacesuits on exhibit. And people can come there, and we'll have panels about that, and people can talk about how they made their spacesuits. And we may even have it be a traveling exhibition that goes to some things like Comic-Con or Worldcon. We'll talk about that.
Really
but
cool.
It's going to be great and thrilling, and no one's ever done anything like that. So I can't wait. It's going to be the rules are very fun. It's like one rule is you have to be able to breathe while wearing it.
Well, yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Mark, I want to be respectful of your time.
Yes, this has been great.
This has been great.
Yes.
I've really enjoyed this, and I wanted to thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
And please subscribe to Mark's YouTube channel, Mr. Sci-Fi.
Yeah.
Takes 10 seconds.
Yeah, and that's the old school spelling, SCI-FI.
Right. So check it out. And anything else you want to add before we sign off?
I'm just grateful to you for doing this interview, John. We're going to have a great future. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to be in Space Command, and I can't wait. And this is a very talented man. So check out everything that he's got going on the internet and beyond. And we'll see you at the Space Command Convention and at the John Tague Convention.
Excellent. Sounds good.
Take care.
Okay, thanks, guys, and we will catch you later.
Bye, guys.